Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I'm going to show you is kind of a two-stage method for getting the Greater Thurian League on the table very quickly, and then with a few little additional bits to bump them up, make them look a bit nicer. In particular, if you're a little more patient and have steadier hands than I do, the glowing blade will probably look a little better on your miniatures, but the technique is sound. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below for this one. Let's get started. So the very first thing to do once you've gone ahead and assembled your miniatures is to prime them. And I've used here white scar. Now any white primer will do here. It's not going to matter if it is the contrast perfect sort of look. What we want is just a nice bright white. So any white primer will do the job. I'm using white scar since I'm going to be using a lot of Citadel paints for this. And if you can get those, there's a pretty good chance you can pick up that white scar too. Now, instead of starting from the bottom layers and working up like I normally would with most miniatures, we're actually going to start by painting this fella's armor. Might sound a little bit roundabout, but we're going to find it easier to touch up any mistakes we make on the armor later, rather than the other way around. And hopefully you'll see what I mean here. What I'm going to do to start off with is get a couple of big dollops of Lahmian medium, and then I'm going to add about the same again in Coelia Greenshade. Now, don't worry too much if your mix isn't exact. Basically, the more medium you have in here, the softer your recess shade is going to appear. You can be quite generous with that Lahmian medium as well. If you want to play around with your ratios, what you can do is get a whole bunch of spare parts, glue them to a bit of sprue, and then just prime them white. Play around with them that way. Once you're satisfied with what you've got though, you're going to go ahead and just apply this over the armor. Don't worry too much if it does settle on your uniform and what have you. It's important, mostly, that we get this into all of the recesses of the armor. Now, it's important that that has plenty of time to dry, because what we're going to do now is to dry brush the armor. If any of this stuff is still wet when you're sort of brushing across it, you're going to pick up that shade, smear it everywhere, and ruin the work you've done. So, patience here, let it dry. What I've got here is a little soft makeup brush. It's about the same size as a Citadel small dry brush. I find them really good for dry brushing because they're nice and soft. What I'm going to do is load up some Deepkin flesh into my brush here, and then work some of it off onto a bit of kitchen towel. It doesn't need to be completely dry here. What we'll then do is start working over the surface of the armor, slowly building up, and leaving that little recess shade intact there. Now it turns out, unfortunately, my camera doesn't really like this color very much. It struggles a bit with the color mix. But anyhow, what you can see is just by going over the armor a few times, I build up that Deepkin flesh, but leave our shading intact. So particularly on the front of the armor here, if you start from the bottom and drag your brush up a few times, you're going to have a little bit of an easier time leaving that recess green intact. So important that you do go over it a few times and build up that color. And hopefully once we're finished with that, my camera will cope with how it should look. Now after a few passes, you'll have something that looks like this. And finally, my camera can figure out what color it actually is. Now this next step is one that you can skip, depending on how quickly you do want to paint these guys. But I think a little bit of extra work here won't really hurt. What I've done is made sure that my dry brush from earlier is nice and dry. And now we're going to go ahead and just bat at some of the edges with a little bit of Praxiti white. We've got that nice greenish tint to the armor, but I think we can get a little bit more depth to it here just by adding a bit of white to some of the edges. And there is our Greater Thurian League armor done. Now from here, the rest of this is not going to differ terribly much from the Warhammer TV method because it works pretty well. But I tend to find that the dry brushing is a lot quicker than painstakingly painting that Coelia Greenshade into the recesses. What I'll do now is start with some Sons of Horus green, and I'm going to start painting his undersuit with this. So just a little bit of water into the paint to make it flow a bit more easily. The only thing you really want to avoid at this stage is any of the armor panels that you have already painted. Don't worry too much if you do end up hitting some of the armor, because we can touch it up, but take your time. This will probably need 2 coats for a nice solid finish. And now we're starting to get somewhere. What I'm going to use now is German Grey, which is a Vallejo color. It's really a very dark grey with a little bit of blue in it. If you want to stick to Citadel, then something here like Corvus Black is a very good substitute. But you'll see the coverage on this is just remarkable. So I tend to find this really useful when I am trying to speed paint something, because I can normally trust with just a little bit of water in my paint, this will cover wonderfully. As well, the less time that you spend painting a miniature, the fewer brush strokes on a miniature, the less likely you are to make a mistake and have to tidy up. So, bit of a funny one. You can also paint in the weapons with this too, but I'm going to go around now, paint in his gloves and such. And as always, the only things I really need to avoid is the armor and the suit that I've just painted. Now the beautiful thing about all of that is that that is just 1 coat. So talking about having the right tool for the job, if you can find German Grey, Vallejo products, either at an online retailer that'll ship to you, or at a local place, if you can find one, do pick it up. It's a must-have in your arsenal. What we'll move on to now is some of the silver details. And for most of these, what I'm going to use is Lead Belcher. Now this covers very well, particularly over some of those areas that we have already done in black. But just take your time here. And any bits that are going to be silver, most of them anyway. This big domed thing in the center here, we're going to paint a little bit differently later on. But for the most part, weapons and little buckles and what have you, a little bit of Lead Belcher now. Now once your metallics are all done, what you can do is start applying the armor color. Now this here is Lupercal Green, and I'm not certain 100% if this is the official color that they use, but I like it. Especially if you've got Sons of Horus Green, it does match very well with that, funnily enough. But it is a little bit thin, so as you can see, this is likely going to need 2 coats. Now particularly up on areas like this little bubble around his helmet, what I'm going to do is start close to the areas that I want to be this darker green, this little ring section here, but keeping my brush sort of pointed up so that if I make a mistake, it's going to flick up and onto the helmet that I am going to paint later anyway. Now, quite regularly you'll hear me mention putting on 2 coats of a color to make sure it's solid. This is what 1 coat of that Lupercal Green will look like. So I'm going to let that dry thoroughly, then apply a second, and you'll see what I mean about a nice smooth base coat being important. I did discover that I'd watered down that a little bit too much, and on some of the flat panels I had to come back with a 3rd coat, so mind how you go. What I'll do now is paint in some Mournfang Brown for the leather. Now once at last you've finished those base coats, do any little bits of tidy up that you need to, and we're going to apply some non-oil over all of those. So into the metal, over the greens that we've painted, and on the leather, get a little bit of non-oil. Don't be too scared of it, of course, and we'll shade all of that. Now once that is at last dry, we're going to pick up some Iron Hand Steel, and finally we're going to paint this little bobble on this dude's helmet. Take your time as you approach the edges where the green is. Now as well, I've also taken that Iron Hand Steel and highlighted just a couple of the little bits of metal on them. You don't have to do a huge amount, just enough to make some of those little areas shine. What I'm going to do now is actually slap the decals on him, because at this point you could base him up and chuck him on the table. He's going to look perfectly fine for bulk infantry, but decals are what are really going to sell those last few details. So we'll pop those on, and then we'll carry on painting with some extra steps. So there, ready for action, is a pretty simple paint job, but we can take it further. So what I'm going to do is start off with a little bit of Reikland Flesh Shade. Just add a tiny wee bit of this to my palette, and a little bit of water. Then what I'm going to do is to paint this about halfway up the dome on his head. You can be quite generous with this if you've thinned it down as much as I have. And let's just go around there. Might add a little bit more shade, actually. And this will give us a neat, faded There we go. Kind of rusty effect around that dome. And there we go, just a little bit of warmth and visual interest to stop that from looking quite so plain. What I'm going to do now is grab one of my little cheap brushes, something small and flat. This one comes from the stationery aisle, and I've got some rust grey. What we'll do is dry brush some of the black areas. We don't need to go mad with this. Make sure you're getting most of this off, and a good place to start is to check up on his back here, because if anything goes wrong with how much you apply, you can very easily fix this area up. But that looks about right. So I'm going to very lightly, and with a little bit of care with this tiny wee brush, just pick out some of the edges of the black details with some dry brushed rust grey. Now, even over things like his suit and his gloves, you could use a different grey for the difference between the gun and his suit, but I don't think you need to. What I'm going to use here now is Ironrack's skin, and we're going to start highlighting his suit. Now, this will go on looking very bright, so feel free to take it slow, and I would recommend thin this down just a little bit more than you ordinarily would. If you're worried about how light it is going on, bear in mind that it will darken down a little as it dries, or what you could do would be to mix up a mix of this with the Sons of Horus green that we used for the base color here. Now, for the dark green parts of his armor, what we'll use to highlight that is Cabalite green. Now, this is quite a rich green, which I think will tie in quite nicely with what we've done so far. Just little bits of this at the edges of areas where you want to accentuate the shape of the armor. Now, that will in truth be quite dark. It is a step that you can skip, but what I'm going to do now is just a tiny bit of Sybarite green, or Sybarite green, and I've thinned this down quite a bit as well, same as I did with the Ironrack skin from earlier. We're just going to do a little bit more of this at the corners of the armor. Now, on quite bright, warm leather like I want here, what I'm going to use is Deathclaw Brown. Ordinarily, you might see me use Scrag Brown here, and that's perfectly acceptable if that's what you've got. But I do want quite a prominent edge on most of these areas. And then, finally, we can start painting the blade. So what I've got here is some white scar. I'm just going to tidy up a little bit where I have splurged over with some of my ink. At the same time with this, if you really want to, you can also edge in some very extreme highlights on parts of the armor. Good opportunity to tidy up any of the, the little black splashes you might have made. And as well, this little light on his chest here. Now, once that's had a chance to dry, what we're going to use is Contrast Imperial Fist. You could use Iyanden Yellow here, but that does tend to dry with a slightly more orange finish to it, and we want to try and avoid that. We'll start applying this and leave just a little bit of white at the top of the blade, where we want to imply that it's much hotter. I might not have left quite enough, but that's okay. I can go back with some white. And as well, dot in his chest lamp. And then, with a little bit of Gryph-hound Orange, what we'll do is work some of that off my brush onto my palette, and then apply that, thinking as much as you can in thirds. Just a little of that along the blade. Now, that's not going to give you the smoothest result, but it is certainly one of the easiest. What I'll do now is just pop a little line of white, just using the edge of my brush here, along the very edge of the blade. Now, from this point, if you wanted to grab some contrast and dot in the little screens and what have you on his wrists, you could do, that's up to you. It's going to take just a couple of seconds and one or two extra colors. But what I'm going to do is very quickly varnish him. I'm going to use a matte over most of them, but I will come back and apply a gloss over his blade. Let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our Hearthkyn warrior from the Greater Thurian League is complete. Now, that unusual icy green color for the armor is really the star of the show here, and I hope this goes to show that it is actually incredibly easy to get that color. I would probably suggest Lupercal green for the armor, that dark green armor. It's a little bit tricky to get a base coat down for that, so If you can find another one that you like the look of, then why not use that? I've gone with Lupercal Green because I think that's the closest to how it looks on the box. But as always, he is a made-up spaceman. You should paint him how you like. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paint and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Rod, Jimmy, and Andrew. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.